High in the Cascade Mountains, where winter silence can kill and civilization feels like a distant memory, 16-year-old Jake Millerton checked his grandfather's snow traps one final time before the storm hit. He'd been using these traditional Inuit hunting methods since he was 8, learned from his grandfather who'd survived 3 tours in Alaska's most brutal terrain. The traps had never failed him until today. The first trap was empty, the second shredded from the inside out. But the third trap made Jake's blood freeze colder than the mountain air. Inside wasn't the rabbit or fox he expected. It was a human hand, still warm, wearing a military ring he'd seen before, the same ring his father wore when he disappeared 5 years ago on a routine camping trip. As Jake stared at the impossible evidence, he heard footsteps crunching through snow behind him. Someone was watching. Someone who knew he'd found what they'd tried so hard to hide. The mountain boy was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. But what had really happened to his father all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's breath crystallized in the frigid air as he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn around, to confront whoever was behind him, but 5 years of mountain living had taught him patience. Predators revealed themselves when they thought their prey was vulnerable. The footsteps stopped. Jake's mind raced as he stared at the severed hand. The ring was unmistakable, a silver Marine Corps insignia with a small dent on the left side where his father had hit it against a rock while building their cabin. But how could this be here? How could any part of his father be here, in a trap Jake had set just yesterday? The wind picked up, howling through the pine trees with an intensity that made his ears ache. Perfect cover. Jake slowly reached for the hunting knife on his belt, his movements deliberate and silent. His grandfather had always said the mountains would teach him everything he needed to know about survival. Right now, they were teaching him about fear. Another crunch of snow, closer this time. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Whoever was behind him was moving again, taking advantage of the wind's noise just as Jake had planned to do. They knew the mountains too. They knew how to hunt. Without warning, Jake spun around, knife drawn. Nothing. The forest stretched before him, an endless maze of snow-laden evergreens and shadows, but something was wrong. The trees here were too uniform, too deliberately placed. In all his years exploring these mountains, Jake had never noticed this particular grove. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted overnight. He looked back at the trap. The hand was gone. Jake's stomach lurched. He dropped to his knees, frantically searching the snow around the trap. His bare fingers burned as they dug through the powder, but there was nothing. No blood, no evidence that anything had ever been there at all. Even the trap showed no signs of disturbance. Looking for something? Jake whirled toward the voice. A man emerged from behind a massive pine, tall and lean with military bearing. He wore winter camouflage and moved with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible. Most disturbing of all, his face was familiar. Older, weathered, but definitely someone Jake had seen before. "Who are you?" Jake's voice came out steadier than he felt. The knife remained firm in his grip. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who knew your father very well. Tom Millerton was a good soldier, Jake. He just learned things he wasn't supposed to know." The use of past tense sent ice through Jake's veins. He is a good man. He's coming back." "Is he?" The stranger took a step closer. "Then why haven't you heard from him in 5 years? Why did the search teams find nothing? Why did the military tell your mother there was no record of any camping trip?" Jake had wondered about these things countless times, lying awake in his cabin listening to his mother cry when she thought he was asleep. The official story had never made sense, but the alternative, that his father was dead, was impossible to accept. "What do you want?" Jake asked. "Same thing you want. The truth." The man gestured toward the empty trap. "Your father discovered something up here, something that certain people would kill to keep secret. He tried to expose it and they silenced him. You're lying." The hand you just saw was real, Jake. Your father is still alive, but not for much longer. There's a facility hidden in these mountains, one that doesn't officially exist. They've been holding him there, using him. The wind died suddenly, leaving the forest in an eerie stillness. In the distance, Jake could hear the rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors. "Time's up," the man said grimly. "They know you found the trap. Run." The metallic tang of blood hit Kyle's nostrils before he saw the trap. His grandfather's ancient snares were scattered throughout these woods, positioned along game trails that hadn't changed in decades. Most had been empty for weeks now, the wildlife growing scarce as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. But this one was different. Kyle crouched beside the twisted metal, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The snow around the trap was stained dark red, almost black in the dim morning light. Whatever had been caught here had bled heavily, but the strange part was the pattern. The blood didn't radiate outward from a struggle. It formed precise lines, as if it had been deliberately arranged. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and used the blade to lift a section of the trap's mechanism. The metal was warm to the touch, despite the sub-zero temperature. That was impossible. Everything in these mountains should have been frozen solid hours ago. A sound echoed through the trees behind him, a low, rhythmic tapping, like Morse code being hammered out on bark. Kyle froze, listening. The tapping came again, closer this time, and with it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in snow. Someone was following his trail. He'd been alone on this mountain for 3 days, checking trap lines his grandfather had maintained for over 40 years. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down the valley, and the Park Service rarely ventured this high in winter. Whoever was out there had deliberately tracked him to this isolated spot. Kyle slipped behind a massive pine, pressing his back against the rough bark. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by labored breathing. Through the gaps between trees, he caught sight of movement, a figure in dark clothing moving with purpose through the snow. The person walked with a slight limp, favoring their left leg, and something glinted in their right hand. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to swallow even the whisper of wind through the branches. Kyle's pulse hammered in his ears as he realized the footsteps had stopped too. The forest had become a vacuum of sound, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. "I know you're there," a voice called out, rough and gravelly. "Saw your tracks leading up from the valley. We need to talk." Kyle remained motionless. The voice carried an accent he couldn't place, with vowels that seemed stretched and consonants that clicked oddly. More disturbing was the fact that the speaker somehow knew exactly where the trap lines ran. This wasn't a lost hiker or curious tourist. "The trap caught something, didn't it?" the voice continued, closer now. "Something that shouldn't exist in these mountains, something that's been waiting a very long time." The footsteps resumed, circling around his position. Whoever this was knew the terrain well enough to move quietly despite the snow. Through a gap in the pine boughs, Kyle caught another glimpse of the figure, tall, wearing a coat that looked military in design, with patches of what might have been insignia on the sleeves. The person's face was hidden beneath a fur-lined hood, but their movement suggested someone younger than the gravelly voice implied. "Your grandfather knew this day would come," the stranger said, now speaking from directly behind Kyle's hiding spot. He left instructions, detailed ones, about what to do when the old safeguards failed. Kyle's blood turned to ice water. His grandfather had died 6 months ago, taking most of his mountain wisdom with him to the grave. But there had been stories, strange tales about things that lived in the deep woods, creatures that the old traps were designed to contain rather than kill. Kyle had dismissed them as the rambling of an old man whose mind was beginning to fade. "He never told you the real purpose of those snares, did he?" The voice was almost conversational now, as if they were discussing weather rather than standing in blood-stained snow. "Your grandfather was part of something much larger, a network that's been keeping certain things locked away for generations." A branch snapped somewhere to Kyle's left, then another to his right. The realization hit him like a physical blow. There wasn't just one person out here. He was surrounded. The trap's been compromised. the original voice continued. Whatever was contained there has been free for hours now. It's probably watching us have this conversation. As if summoned by those words, a new sound drifted through the trees, a low, inhuman growling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in seconds, and the snow beneath Kyle's feet began to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow. His simple hunting expedition had just become something far more deadly. The metallic taste of fear coated Kai's mouth as he forced himself to move closer to the trap. Each step through the snow felt like walking toward his own execution, but something compelled him forward, a mixture of morbid curiosity and the desperate need to understand what he'd stumbled into. The figure in the pit had stopped thrashing, but Kai could hear labored breathing echoing from below. Definitely human, then. But what kind of person wore tactical gear this advanced and moved through his mountains without leaving any trace until now? He positioned himself at the edge of the pit, rifle ready, and peered down. The man, it was clearly a man now, lay crumpled against the wooden stakes at the bottom. Blood seeped through tears in his black combat suit, but the wounds didn't look fatal. The gear was unlike anything Kai had seen before, covered in some kind of adaptive camouflage that seemed to shift and blur even as he watched. No wonder he'd never spotted any intruders. The stranger's head turned upward, revealing a face that belonged in Kai's nightmares. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes like chips of Arctic ice, and a thin smile that held no warmth whatsoever. When he spoke, his accent was unplaceable, European maybe, but refined in a way that suggested expensive education and darker applications. "Clever boy," the man said, his voice carrying easily out of the pit despite his obvious pain. "Very clever indeed. These traps are beautifully crafted. Ancient design but perfectly executed." Kai kept his rifle trained on the figure below. "Who are you? What do you want?" Ice formed in Kai's stomach. "My grandfather's cabin? There's nothing there but old hunting gear and maps," Volkov interrupted, pushing himself up to a sitting position with practiced ease despite his injuries. "Very old maps. Maps that show things which shouldn't exist anymore, things that certain people would pay handsomely to find." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. The systematic searching of his trap lines, the strange feeling of being watched. This man had been casing the area for weeks, learning Kai's patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You've been following me," Kai said. It wasn't a question. "Following, studying, admiring your technique." Volkov's smile widened. "Your grandfather taught you well before he died. Magnus was always resourceful, even when we were hunting him 40 years ago." The world tilted sideways. Kai's grandfather Magnus had been a simple mountain man, a hermit who preferred the company of wildlife to people. He'd never mentioned being hunted by anyone, never spoke of maps or secrets. But then again, Magnus had always been reluctant to discuss his past. "You're lying," Kai managed, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Am I? Tell me, boy. Did he ever explain why he chose to live so far from civilization? Why he insisted on teaching you to survive as if the world might end tomorrow? Why every trail he showed you had 3 different escape routes?" Each word hit like a physical blow. Those things were true. Magnus had been almost obsessive about preparation, about having backup plans for everything. Kai had always assumed it was just the paranoia of an old mountain man, but now, "What maps?" Kai heard himself ask. Volkov's eyes gleamed with triumph. During the war, certain German expeditions discovered things in these mountains, things the Allies were very interested in recovering. Your grandfather was part of the team that found them first, but he never turned over everything he discovered. The official records show 3 sites were cleared, but Magnus found 4. The rifle trembled in Kai's hands. This was impossible. His grandfather had barely spoken German, let alone been involved in some wartime conspiracy. "You're insane. The 4th site contains something remarkable, boy. Something that makes men like me very wealthy and governments very nervous. Magnus hid the location, but he was clever. He left clues for someone who knew where to look, someone he trusted to carry on if needed. A terrible understanding crept through Kai's mind. The late-night conversations where Magnus would stop mid-sentence, claiming he'd said too much. The locked wooden chest in the cabin that Kai had never been allowed to open. The way Magnus would sometimes stare at the distant peaks as if seeing ghosts in the snow. "Even if any of this is true," Kai said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "I don't know anything about maps or hidden sites." Volkov struggled to his feet, seemingly unconcerned by the rifle pointed at him. "Perhaps not yet, but you will. And when you do, I'll be waiting. These mountains are vast, but not vast enough to hide from people like me forever." The stranger pulled something from his belt, a small device that began beeping rapidly. The second trap yielded nothing but disturbed earth and the lingering scent of something metallic that made Kai's stomach turn. Whatever had been caught here had torn free with enough force to snap the ancient hemp rope his grandfather had woven decades ago, the rope that had never failed before. Kai crouched beside the ruined snare, his breath forming small clouds in the morning air. The ground told a story he didn't want to read. Deep gouges in the frozen earth suggested claws, but the spacing was all wrong for any animal he knew. Too wide for a wolf, too narrow for a bear, and the pattern was unlike anything in his mental catalogue of mountain predators. A droplet of something dark stained the snow nearby. Kai dipped his finger into it and immediately recoiled. The liquid was warm, impossibly warm for something that should have frozen hours ago in these temperatures. It had the consistency of blood but left a tingling sensation on his skin that felt like touching a live wire. He wiped his finger frantically on his jacket and stood, scanning the tree line with new urgency. The forest felt different now, as if the very air had shifted while he examined the trap. The natural sounds he'd grown up with, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of ravens, the soft settling of snow-laden branches, had been replaced by an oppressive silence that made his ears ring. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Kai spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. Nothing moved among the trees, but he could feel eyes watching him. Not the casual curiosity of woodland creatures, but something calculating and patient, something that understood exactly what it was looking at. "Hello?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. The words seemed to die just feet from his lips, swallowed by the unnatural quiet. No response came, but the sensation of being observed intensified. Kai backed away from the destroyed trap, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. Each step felt deliberate and exposed, as if he were performing for an invisible audience. The third trap was 50 yards downhill, positioned near a game trail the deer had used for generations. As Kai approached it, he noticed the snow around the area had been disturbed in a wide circle, as if something had thrashed wildly before escaping. This trap too had been torn apart, but here he found something that made his blood run cold. Caught in the remaining fibers of the broken snare was a piece of fabric, not fur, not hide, but woven cloth. Dark material that felt expensive between his fingers, despite being shredded and stained with that same unnaturally warm substance he'd found at the previous site. Kai held the fabric up to catch the filtered sunlight streaming through the canopy. The weave was tight and uniform, clearly machine-made, but the edges where it had torn showed something impossible. The threads weren't cut or ripped. They appeared to have been dissolved, as if exposed to acid. A low sound drifted through the trees, barely audible but unmistakably unnatural. It started as a rumble, like distant thunder, but gradually shifted into something that resembled breathing, deep, measured inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Kai's survival instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, screamed at him to run. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When you don't understand the danger, moving fast will only get you killed faster. Observe, learn, then act." He forced himself to remain still and listen. The breathing sound continued, circling him slowly. Whatever was making it was large enough to move through the underbrush without much concern for stealth, confident enough to announce its presence rather than hide it. As the sound passed behind a cluster of ancient pines to his left, Kai caught a glimpse of movement, not the quick dart of a forest animal, but something deliberate and upright. The shape was wrong for a person, too tall and moving with a fluidity that seemed to ignore the rough terrain and obstacles that would slow any human. The breathing stopped. Kai waited, every muscle tense, for nearly a full minute before the silence was broken by a new sound. Footsteps. But they weren't coming from where he'd seen the movement. They were approaching from directly ahead of him, measured and purposeful. Something was walking toward him through the trees. Kai's hand tightened on his knife handle as a figure began to materialize through the forest shadows. Tall, wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The face was obscured by distance and the interplay of light and shadow, but there was something wrong with the proportions. Something that made Kai's mind struggle to process what he was seeing. The figure stopped, just at the edge of clear visibility, and raised one arm in what might have been a greeting, or might have been something else entirely. Then, it spoke his name. The ancient rope held firm, despite the violent thrashing from below. Kyle crouched at the pit's edge, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he peered down at his impossible catch. The figure had stopped moving, but he could see the subtle rise and fall of breathing beneath the tattered clothing. What disturbed him most wasn't the stranger's presence. Mountain hikers occasionally wandered off marked trails, though rarely this far into the backcountry. It was the condition of the man's gear. The fabric looked wrong, almost primitive, yet showed signs of craftsmanship that seemed both crude and sophisticated. The leather boots were handmade but worn in patterns that suggested years of use, not the kind of weekend adventure wear he'd expect from a lost tourist. Kyle pulled his grandfather's field journal from his jacket pocket, flipping to the pages filled with sketches of trap configurations and notes about placement. Old Henrik had been meticulous, documenting every detail of their family's hunting traditions passed down through generations. But nowhere in these yellowed pages had his grandfather mentioned traps catching anything like this. A low moan echoed from the pit. "Hey," Kyle called down. "You hurt?" The figure stirred, turning slowly toward the sound of his voice. When the stranger looked up, Kyle felt his stomach drop. The man's eyes were pale, almost colorless, and held an alertness that contradicted his disheveled appearance. More unsettling was the complete absence of surprise or fear. Most people who found themselves trapped in a 6-foot pit would show some emotion. This man simply stared, as if calculating. "The old ways still hold," the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent Kyle couldn't place. "Henrik's boy, I assume." Ice formed in Kyle's veins. His grandfather had been dead for 3 years, and before that had lived as a hermit for the last decade of his life. How could this man know him? "How do you know my grandfather?" The stranger shifted position, testing the rope around his ankle with practiced movements. "I knew him when he was young, before he learned to keep certain secrets." The man's gaze fixed on Kyle with uncomfortable intensity. "Before he learned what these mountains really hide." Kyle's hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt. Every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity held him frozen at the pit's edge. "What are you talking about?" "The traps aren't for deer, boy. They never were." The stranger's voice carried a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made his words more chilling. "Your family has been guardians for longer than these mountains have had names." Henrik understood his duty, even if he grew weak in his final years. Guardians of what? Before the stranger could answer, a sound drifted through the forest that made both men freeze. It started as a low whistle, almost musical, but carried an undertone that seemed to vibrate in Kyle's chest. The sound came from the direction of the higher peaks, where the tree line gave way to exposed rock and permanent snow. The stranger's composure cracked for the first time. "No," he whispered, pulling frantically at the rope. "It's too early. The barriers should hold for another season." "What barriers?" Kyle demanded, but the stranger was no longer listening. The whistling sound grew closer, and with it came a smell, something between ozone and decay, like the air after lightning strikes mixed with the odor of old bones. The forest around them fell silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, even the ever-present whisper of wind through pine needles ceased. Kyle's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement, but saw only shadows that seemed deeper than they should be in the afternoon light. "Cut the rope," the stranger hissed. "If you have any sense, cut the rope and run." "Why should I trust you?" The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that Kyle could hear his own heartbeat. Then, from somewhere in the darkness between the trees, came the sound of footsteps. Not the irregular gait of someone picking their way through forest debris, but measured, purposeful steps that seemed to know exactly where they were going. The stranger had gone pale, because, Henrik's boy, there are things in these mountains that your family's traps were meant to catch, and there are things they were meant to keep out. He looked up at Kyle with desperate eyes, and something just broke through. Kyle's hand trembled as he reached for his knife. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by a sound like breaking ice and the creak of old wood. Whatever approached through the forest was large enough to snap branches without changing pace. His grandfather's journal felt heavy in his pocket, filled with secrets he was only beginning to understand. As he gripped the knife's handle, Kyle realized that his simple hunting expedition had become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of visibility, waiting. The rope burned against Kai's palms as he rappelled down the cliff face, his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Every muscle in his body screamed protest from the previous night's ordeal, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not when those things were still out there, hunting him like he was nothing more than prey. The abandoned mining shaft waited 30 feet below, its entrance carved into the mountain's belly like a gaping wound. Kai had discovered it years ago during one of his exploration runs, but had never ventured deep inside. The locals whispered stories about the old Blackstone mine, how it had been sealed in 1952 after a series of mysterious accidents claimed 17 lives. The official reports blamed methane gas and structural collapse, but the mountain folk knew better. They knew some places were better left undisturbed. His boots touched solid ground with a muffled thud. The air here was different, thick with the metallic taste of deep earth and something else, something that made his skin crawl. He unhooked his climbing gear and pulled the tactical knife from his belt, its weight reassuring in his trembling hand. The shaft stretched ahead into absolute darkness, wooden support beams sagging under decades of neglect. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing like a countdown timer. Kai forced himself forward, his headlamp beam dancing across rusted mining equipment and collapsed sections of tunnel. He'd made it maybe 50 yards when he heard it, a sound that froze his blood in his veins. Footsteps, multiple sets moving with purpose through the tunnels behind him. They'd found his entry point. Kai broke into a run, his light bouncing wildly as he navigated around fallen timbers and pools of stagnant water. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 separate passages. He chose the middle path on instinct, praying it would lead deeper into the mountain rather than to a dead end. The passage narrowed, forcing him to duck under low-hanging beams. His breathing echoed in the confined space, harsh and ragged. Behind him, the footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by what sounded like voices, but not human voices. The syllables were wrong, twisted into shapes no human throat should make. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast cavern, and Kai stumbled to a halt. His headlamp illuminated walls covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing light. They weren't Native American petroglyphs or mining company markers. These were something else entirely, carved deep into the living rock with tools that left peculiar scoring patterns. In the center of the cavern sat a structure that defied explanation. It looked almost like an altar, built from stones that didn't match the local geology. The rocks were black as obsidian but shot through with veins of something that glowed faintly in his light. Around the altar's base, the ground was stained dark with substances that might have been blood. though the stains looked far too old to be from any recent sacrifice. Kai approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but something drew him forward, a compulsion he couldn't resist. As he got closer, he could see that the altar's surface was covered in the same writhing symbols that decorated the walls. They seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, like a heartbeat made of stone and shadow. The voices in the tunnel were getting louder now, accompanied by the scrape of claws against rock. Whatever was hunting him had definitely found his trail. Kai looked around desperately for another exit and spotted a narrow crevice in the far wall. It was barely wide enough for a man, but it was his only option. He squeezed through the opening just as the first of his pursuers entered the cavern. The creature's silhouette filled his peripheral vision, tall and wrong-angled, moving with joints that bent in directions that made his mind rebel. He didn't dare look back for a better view. The crevice led to another passage, this one sloping sharply downward. Kai half ran, half slid along its length, his hands scraping against the rough walls for balance. The air was growing warmer as he descended, and he could smell something that reminded him of sulfur and burned metal. The passage finally leveled out, opening into another chamber. This one was different, older somehow, as if it predated human presence on the mountain by eons. The walls here weren't carved with symbols, but seemed to be made of the symbols, as if the rock itself had grown into those alien shapes. And there, in the center of the chamber, was something that made Kai's rational mind shut down completely. It was a doorway, but not to another tunnel or cave. Through its frame he could see a landscape that belonged to no world he recognized. Strange geometries stretched to horizons lit by colors that had no names. The air shimmering through the opening carried sounds like whispered madness. Kai backed away slowly, his headlamp beam trembling across the impossible sight. Behind him, the voices of his pursuers echoed through the passage. He was trapped between the hunters and whatever lay beyond that otherworldly threshold. The creature's blood had turned black against the snow, creating an abstract pattern that made Kai's stomach churn. He'd been staring at the trap site for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. The bent metal stakes told a story of impossible strength, while the deep gouges in the frozen earth suggested claws that belonged to no animal he'd ever encountered. His grandfather's journal felt heavy in his jacket pocket as he knelt beside the largest blood stain. The leather binding had grown warm against his chest during the hike down, as if responding to proximity to whatever had been caught here. Kai pulled it out with trembling fingers, thumbing through pages of cramped handwriting until he found the entry that had been haunting him. The old ones do not die easily. Their blood runs thick and dark like oil from deep places. When wounded, they retreat to the high caves where the ancient ice never melts. Follow the blood trail only if you are prepared for what waits at the end. The blood trail led north toward Devil's Ridge, where the mountain peaks formed a natural fortress of stone and ice. Kai had explored those heights dozens of times, mapping every cave and crevice he could safely reach. But now he wondered what lay in the spaces he'd deemed too dangerous to investigate. His radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Kai, you copy?" Sarah's voice carried static and worry in equal measure. "I'm here," he replied, keeping his voice low despite being alone on the mountainside. Kai's blood ran cold. 2 more. Couple from Denver, last seen yesterday afternoon heading up the North Trail, their cars still at the ranger station parking lot. The North Trail. It ran directly below Devil's Ridge, following an old mining road that switchbacked through the most remote section of the wilderness. If something was hunting from the high caves, anyone on that trail would be perfectly positioned prey. "Sarah, you need to tell the sheriff to close all access to the North Trail immediately. Don't let anyone else go up there." Static filled the radio for several seconds before her voice returned, tense and questioning. "What did you find, Kai? You're scaring me." He looked down at the black blood soaking into the snow, at his grandfather's journal with its cryptic warnings, at the claw marks scarring the landscape like territorial markers. How could he explain any of this without sounding insane? "Just trust me on this one. The North Trail needs to be closed until we can figure out what's happening up here. The sheriff's not going to like that without a good reason. Tourism season's starting, and then tell him I found evidence of a large predator, something bigger than anything that's supposed to be in these mountains. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it fell far short of the complete truth. Kai signed off and tucked the radio away, then began following the blood trail up the steep slope. The drops were spaced farther apart now, suggesting the creature was moving more carefully, perhaps weakening from its wounds. But the prints in the snow told a different story. Whatever this thing was, it was still moving with purpose and power. As he climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew more twisted, their branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. Patches of bare rock jutted through the snow cover, worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. This was old land, shaped by forces that predated human settlement by millennia. The blood trail led to a narrow ledge that Kai had never noticed before, hidden behind a curtain of icicles hanging from an overhang above. He approached carefully, testing each footstep on the icy surface. The ledge was wider than it appeared from below, extending back into the mountain face in a natural corridor. Fresh scratches marked the rock walls, and the metallic scent of blood grew stronger as Kai moved deeper into the passage. His flashlight beam revealed a network of tunnels branching off in multiple directions, carved from living rock by unknown hands. The architecture was unlike anything he'd seen before, too organic to be human work, too purposeful to be natural formation. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep in the tunnel system, causing loose stones to rattle against the walls. Kai froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Instead, a new smell reached his nostrils, something ancient and musky, like old leather mixed with decay. His grandfather's journal seemed to pulse in his pocket, as if the words written decades ago were responding to their proximity to the truth. Somewhere in these tunnels, wounded and angry, the creature waited. And Kai realized he was no longer the hunter. The descent into the cavern felt like entering the throat of some ancient beast. Ethan's headlamp carved weak circles of light through the oppressive darkness, revealing smooth stone walls that bore strange, deliberate markings. Not natural formations, these were carved, purposeful, old beyond measure. His boots found purchase on what seemed to be worn steps, though they were unlike any architecture he'd ever seen. Too wide for human feet, too shallow, as if designed for something that moved differently than he did. The air grew warmer as he descended, carrying with it an earthy smell tinged with something metallic that made his stomach turn. Behind him, the trapped creature's breathing echoed off the walls in ragged, uneven rhythms. It had stopped struggling against the modified snare, but Ethan could feel its presence like a weight pressing against his shoulder blades. Whatever it was, it followed willingly now, as if this descent was exactly what it wanted. The passage opened into a vast chamber that swallowed his headlamp's beam entirely. Ethan swept the light across the space, catching glimpses of more carved symbols on distant walls, strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made him stop breathing. A pit, perfectly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, carved with the same impossible precision as everything else in this place. But unlike the rough stone surrounding it, the pit's edges were smooth as glass, almost reflective. And from its depths came a sound, not quite humming, not quite singing, but something that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. "Jesus," he whispered, and his voice was immediately swallowed by the darkness. The creature behind him made a sound, something between a growl and a sigh, and Ethan turned to see it clearly for the first time. His headlamp illuminated features that his mind struggled to process. Humanoid, yes, but stretched and wrong. 2 long limbs ending in fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. Skin that seemed to shift color in the light, like oil on water. And eyes, too many eyes, arranged in patterns across what might have been a face. It wasn't looking at him. It was looking at the pit. And in those multiple gazes, Ethan saw something that chilled him more than the creature's appearance. recognition, longing. This thing knew this place. "What is this?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. But the creature's mouth, or what served as one, opened, and sounds emerged. Not words exactly, but patterns of tone and rhythm that almost seemed like language. It gestured toward the pit with one impossibly long arm, and Ethan realized it was trying to communicate. He took a step closer to the pit's edge, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. The humming grew louder, and he could swear he saw movement in the depths, shifting shadows that suggested vast spaces below. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a passage, a doorway, a throat leading somewhere else entirely. The creature made more sounds, urgent now, and pointed not just at the pit but at Ethan himself, then back at the pit. A pattern, a message, understanding hit him like ice water. "You want me to go down there?" The creature's multiple eyes fixed on him, and it nodded, a disturbingly human gesture from something so utterly inhuman. Then it began to change. Its form flowed like liquid, bones reshaping, features rearranging. In moments, Ethan found himself staring at his own face, his own body, though the eyes remained wrong. Too many, too knowing. "No," he breathed, backing away from both the creature and the pit. "No, no, no." But the creature wearing his face smiled with his mouth and spoke with his voice. "You set the traps, Ethan. You called us home." The words echoed in the chamber, multiplying and distorting until they became part of the humming from the pit. And with growing horror, Ethan realized the creature was right. The locations where he'd placed his snares, the specific spots his grandfather had taught him, they weren't random hunting grounds. They were markers, waypoints, a summoning circle carved across miles of mountainside. The humming intensified, and more shapes began emerging from the darkness at the chamber's edges. Tall shadows that moved wrong, flowing forms that might once have been human but had been changed by whatever lay in that pit. They formed a loose circle around him, patient as predators, watching with too many eyes. The creature wearing his face tilted its head. Grandfather knew. He prepared the way. "Now it's your turn." Ethan's hand found the knife at his belt, though he knew it would be useless against these things. "My grandfather died years ago." "Did he?" The false Ethan's smile widened impossibly. "Look closer." From the shifting crowd of watchers, a familiar figure stepped forward, weathered features, flannel shirt, work boots. But the eyes, those same wrongly multiplied eyes, gave it away. "Hello, boy," his grandfather said in a voice like grinding stone. "Ready to learn the family business?" The ancient symbols carved into the cave wall seemed to pulse in the flickering torchlight, each mark telling a story Kai wished he couldn't read. His grandfather's journal trembled in his hands as he cross-referenced the weathered pages with the petroglyphs before him. The translations matched perfectly, confirming his worst fears. "The watchers sleep beneath the ice," he whispered, reading aloud from his grandfather's cramped handwriting. "When the traps sing with inhuman voices, the old compact is broken." A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep in the mountain's belly, and Kai felt the cave floor vibrate beneath his boots. He'd heard that sound twice before, once when he'd first discovered the creature in his trap, and again when he'd fled the cabin. Now he understood what it meant. They were waking up. The journal's next passage made his blood run cold. 3 guardians maintain the seal. When one fails, the others weaken. When all 3 fall, the mountain bleeds. Kai counted the locations marked on his grandfather's hand-drawn map. 3 ancient trap sites, positioned in a perfect triangle around the mountain's core. He'd maintained 2 of them religiously, just as his family had for generations. But the third, the one he'd avoided since childhood because of the inexplicable dread it inspired, that trap had been silent for 15 years. Another rumble shook the cave, stronger this time. Dust rained from the ceiling as Kai stuffed the journal into his pack and grabbed his torch. He had to reach the 3rd site before a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind erupted from the depths. The torch flame guttered wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently across the cave walls. In those shifting patterns, Kai glimpsed shapes that shouldn't exist, tall, angular forms with too many joints and eyes like burning coals. He ran. The cave entrance felt impossibly far away as he stumbled through the narrow passages, his torch barely illuminating the treacherous footing. Behind him, that inhuman wailing grew louder, joined by other voices that harmonized in frequencies that made his teeth ache. The mountain itself seemed to be screaming. Bursting into daylight, Kai gulped the thin mountain air and oriented himself. The third trap site lay 2 miles northeast, in a depression he'd always avoided. As a child, he'd called it the sick place because nothing grew there properly. Plants that ventured into that hollow came out twisted and wrong, if they survived at all. Now he knew why. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained a threatening grey that seemed to press down on the peaks. As Kai worked his way across the treacherous terrain, he noticed other wrongnesses creeping into his familiar landscape. Trees stood at impossible angles, their bark sporting geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The snow itself had taken on an oily quality, reflecting colors that had no names. A distant howl echoed across the mountainside, not the creature from his trap, but something else, something that answered from the opposite direction. Then another voice joined the chorus, and another, until the entire range seemed to vibrate with their alien song. Kai pushed harder, his snowshoes biting deep into the corrupted snow. The third sight drew closer with each labored step, but so did the sounds behind him. Whatever was emerging from the mountain's depths, it was gaining ground. The depression appeared ahead, a perfect circle of dead earth surrounded by malformed trees. At its center stood the remains of the oldest trap his family had ever built, a construction of bone and stone that predated even his grandfather's grandfather. The binding ropes had rotted away decades ago, leaving only the skeletal framework. But it wasn't empty. Something massive coiled within the trap's boundaries, held not by physical restraints, but by forces Kai couldn't comprehend. The creature was beautiful and terrible simultaneously, its crystalline flesh refracting light into patterns that made reality seem negotiable. Unlike the thing he'd caught in his modern trap, this entity radiated an intelligence so vast it made him feel like an insect. It noticed him immediately. "Little guardian," it spoke without words, its voice resonating directly in Kai's skull. "Your bloodline has tended us well, but the compact weakens. Soon we will walk again beneath the sun." Kai approached the trap's perimeter, his grandfather's journal clutched like a talisman. The pages fluttered open to a section he hadn't seen before, revealing instructions written in his grandfather's final shaking hand. "To renew the compact," he read aloud, his voice barely audible over the creature's psychic presence, "blood of the guardian willingly given. But know this, the price doubles with each renewal. What was once a drop becomes a cup. What was once a cup becomes a life." The creature's laughter was like wind chimes made of broken dreams. Around them, the mountain continued its alien song, and Kai realized he had perhaps minutes before the other entities arrived. In his hand, his grandfather's knife felt impossibly heavy. The choice was no choice at all. The satellite phone crackled to life in Marcus's trembling hands, its green display cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a beacon of hope. He'd retrieved it from his emergency cache 3 miles down the mountain, a grueling trek that had cost him precious hours and nearly all his remaining strength. "Emergency services, what's your location?" Marcus pressed his back against the granite outcropping, eyes scanning the tree line. "This is Marcus Chen, coordinates 46.7 north, 1 to 21.4 west. I need immediate evacuation. There's been..." He paused, struggling to find words that wouldn't make him sound insane. "Multiple fatalities, armed hostiles in the area. Sir, can you repeat your location? We're showing you in a restricted zone." The words hit him like ice water. "Restricted? What do you mean restricted?" Static filled the line for several heartbeats. When the dispatcher returned, her voice carried a different tone, colder, more professional. "Sir, I need you to remain exactly where you are. A team will be dispatched to your location." The line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Restricted zone. How long had these mountains been under some kind of surveillance? How long had he been living in what amounted to a government laboratory? A branch snapped somewhere below his position. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus clicked off the phone's display and slipped it into his pack. The sound had come from the direction of his old cabin, or what remained of it. After the chaos of the previous night, he'd assumed the place would be swarming with those black-clad operatives, but the forest had been eerily quiet, too quiet. He picked his way down the slope, using game trails he'd memorized over years of hunting these ridges. Every shadow could hide a rifle barrel, every tree trunk might conceal an enemy. But something drove him forward, the need to understand what he'd stumbled into, what had been happening under his nose all these years. The cabin came into view through the pines, its windows dark and shattered. The bodies from the firefight were gone, but dark stains in the snow marked where they'd fallen. Someone had been here, cleaned up the evidence. Professional work. Marcus circled wide, approaching from the north where the terrain offered better cover. That's when he saw it, a glint of metal half buried in the snow near his ruined workshop. Moving closer, he recognized the device immediately. It was identical to the one he'd found strapped to the creature's leg, the same high-tech tracking collar, but this one was different, newer, and it was still transmitting, a steady red pulse that blinked every 3 seconds. His blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. The collar wasn't from the creature he'd caught. This one belonged to something else, something that had been here recently, something that might still be here. A low growl rumbled from the tree line behind him. Marcus spun, his rifle coming up in one fluid motion. 30 yards away, partially concealed by a massive Douglas fir, something watched him with eyes that reflected the pre-dawn light like twin stars. The shape was wrong, too tall, too angular to be any animal he knew, but it moved with predatory grace as it emerged from hiding. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, its limbs elongated and covered in what looked like a mixture of coarse fur and metallic plating. Surgical scars crisscrossed its torso, and where its left arm should have been, a mechanical appendage whirred softly as it flexed articulated fingers. This wasn't just genetic manipulation, it was cybernetic enhancement. The thing that had once been an animal tilted its head, studying him with an intelligence that made Marcus's skin crawl. Behind those modified eyes was awareness, calculation. It was learning him, measuring him as a threat. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, "what did they do to you?" The creature's response was a sound somewhere between a roar and electronic static. It dropped to all fours, muscles bunching for a charge. Rolling behind the cabin's foundation, Marcus worked the rifle's bolt and tried to control his breathing. Standard ammunition was useless against this thing. He needed something with more penetration, or better yet, he needed to stop thinking like this was a hunting problem. This was a war problem. The creature's heavy footsteps circled the cabin, probing for his location. Marcus caught a glimpse of movement through a gap in the foundation stones. The thing was trying to flank him using the same tactical awareness he'd seen in the black-clad soldiers. They weren't just creating monsters, they were creating weapons. Intelligent, enhanced weapons that could think and adapt. And now one of their experiments was hunting him with all the patience and cunning of an apex predator that had learned the art of war. The ancient symbols carved into the cave wall seemed to pulse with their own life as Marcus traced them with his flashlight beam. Each marking told a story he was only beginning to understand, a chronicle of guardians and watchers of something that had been contained here for generations beyond memory. Sarah's breathing echoed behind him, sharp and anxious. "We need to leave now." But Marcus couldn't tear himself away. The final panel showed something that made his blood run cold. Figures in modern clothing, unmistakably recent additions to the ancient artwork. One bore a striking resemblance to his grandfather. "He knew," Marcus whispered. Grandfather knew exactly what was up here. The sound that answered him wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a low, rhythmic scraping, like claws on stone, coming from somewhere deep in the cave system behind them. Both of them froze, flashlights suddenly feeling inadequate against the pressing darkness. "The dynamite," Sarah breathed. "We triggered something when we blasted the entrance." Marcus grabbed her hand and they moved deeper into the cave, away from the scraping sounds. The passage narrowed, forcing them to crouch, then opened into another chamber. This one was different, more recent. Military equipment lined the walls, some dating back decades, others more modern. Radio equipment, weapons, surveillance gear. "This is a monitoring station," Sarah realized, examining a bank of equipment that looked relatively new. "Someone's been watching this place." Marcus found a logbook, its pages filled with entries in multiple handwritings spanning 50 years. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago, the day he'd first checked his traps. His hands shook as he read the final notation: "Containment compromised. Subject mobile. Initiating Protocol 7. Protocol 7, he read aloud. "What the hell is Protocol 7? The scraping sounds were getting closer, accompanied now by something else. A sound like whispered voices, too distorted to understand but unmistakably human in origin, or what had once been human. Sarah was frantically checking the radio equipment. "Some of this is still active," she said, flipping switches. Static filled the chamber, then cleared into voices. "Containment failure at Site Blackrock. Civilian involvement confirmed. Recommend immediate termination of all witnesses." Marcus lunged for the radio. "This is Marcus Chen. Who is this? What's happening up here?" Silence stretched for long seconds before a new voice crackled through. Older, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. "Hello, Marcus. I was hoping we wouldn't have to meet like this. Who are you?" "Someone who knew your grandfather very well. Someone who spent the last 30 years trying to keep what you've unleashed from reaching the valley below." The scraping sounds stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Your grandfather was part of a team that found something in these mountains in 1952, the voice continued. "Something that should have stayed buried. When the military experiments failed, when they lost control, your grandfather volunteered to stay behind. To keep watch. Experiments on what? On survival, on adaptation, on what happens when you take human subjects and push them beyond every natural limit." The voice turned bitter. "We succeeded beyond our worst nightmares." Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, pointing toward the passage they'd entered through. Something was moving in the darkness, multiple somethings, judging by the soft shuffle of feet on stone. "The traps your grandfather taught you to make," the voice said. "They weren't for hunting animals. They were early warning systems, containment measures. When you found one of the subjects 3 days ago, you set off alarms we've been monitoring for decades. The thing in my trap, it was human? It was human once. Before the modifications, before the enhancements that were supposed to create the perfect mountain soldier, before everything went wrong, and they became something else entirely." The shuffling sounds were closer now, and with them came a smell that made Marcus gag. The stench of decay mixed with something chemical, medicinal. "How many?" Marcus whispered into the radio. "We lost count after the first generation started reproducing. They've been contained to the high peaks for 60 years, but you've damaged their territory. They're moving lower, following you." A shape appeared at the edge of their flashlight beams, tall, impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. What had once been a face turned toward them, and Marcus saw eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, set in features that were human but wrong, stretched and modified beyond recognition. "The cave system has multiple exits," the voice crackled urgently. "Follow the main passage north. We're sending extraction to coordinates I'm transmitting now. You have maybe 10 minutes before they decide you're prey instead of just a curiosity." More shapes emerged from the darkness, surrounding them with patient, predatory stillness. Marcus counted at least 6, but the shadows suggested more. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing tight. "Together," she whispered. Marcus nodded, shouldering his rifle and checking his remaining ammunition. 6 rounds, maybe 7 if he'd miscounted. It wouldn't be nearly enough. The abandoned mining camp materialized from the snow like a ghost town frozen in time. Weathered wooden structures leaned against each other for support, their roofs sagging under decades of accumulated ice and debris. Jacob pulled his hood tighter as wind whipped through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving operation. "This place has been dead for 40 years, he muttered, following the creature's tracks between collapsed buildings. The prints led directly toward the larger structure, a mining office that still retained most of its walls and roof. The tracks stopped at the building's entrance. Jacob crouched, studying the disturbed snow. No exit tracks. Whatever he'd been pursuing was still inside. He circled the building, noting boarded windows and a single door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Through gaps in the weathered boards, he caught glimpses of movement in the shadows within. His grip tightened on his rifle as he approached the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, shafts of pale light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. The creature sat in the far corner, no longer attempting to hide or flee. Up close, Jacob could see the intelligence burning in those two human eyes. The thing was badly wounded. Dark fluid seeped from gashes across its torso where his trap had caught it. But it wasn't dying. If anything, the wounds seemed to be closing themselves, the torn flesh knitting back together with unnatural speed. "What are you?" Jacob whispered. The creature tilted its head, studying him with the same curiosity he felt. When it spoke, its voice was a harsh rasp that shouldn't have been possible from that throat. "Home," it said simply. This was home. Jacob's blood went cold. The word was clear, unmistakable English despite the distorted vocal cords producing it. He took a step back, rifle raised, but the creature made no aggressive moves. "You can talk. Remember, talking." The thing's gaze drifted around the ruined office, taking in rotted furniture and scattered papers. "Worked here. Long time ago." The implications hit Jacob like an avalanche. This wasn't some unknown species that had wandered down from higher elevations. This was something that had once been human, someone who had worked in this very building before the mine closed. "The mining accident," Jacob breathed. 40 years ago. My grandfather mentioned it once. A cave-in that killed several workers. They never recovered all the bodies." The creature's head snapped back toward him, those burning eyes focusing with startling intensity. Bodies changed, deep places change things. Jacob's mind raced. The mine had gone deeper than anyone realized, deeper than the official reports indicated. The workers hadn't died in the cave-in. They'd found something down there, something that had transformed them into these nightmare hybrids of human and beast. "How many of you are there?" "Few. Now, very few." The creature's voice carried a note of profound sadness. "Cold makes us sleep. Hunger wakes us. The other traps. The missing hikers over the years." Jacob felt sick as the pieces fell into place. "You've been hunting people. Must eat." The thing's expression was almost apologetic. "Cannot help what we became. But you..." It leaned forward slightly. "You smell of the deep places. You have been below." Jacob thought of the cave system he'd discovered, the unnatural warmth that had drawn him deeper than he'd ever gone before. The strange symbols carved into stone walls, the sense that he was trespassing in spaces never meant for human eyes. "The caves aren't natural, are they?" "Older. Much older." The creature's wounds had almost completely healed now. It rose to its feet with fluid grace, no longer the wounded animal Jacob had tracked through the forest. "They called to us, made us better, stronger." "Better?" Jacob's voice cracked. "Look at what you've become! Look at what you are becoming." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jacob stumbled backward, remembering his enhanced night vision, his increased strength and endurance, the way he'd been drawn repeatedly back to the caves despite every instinct telling him to stay away. "No, I'm not like you. Not yet." The creature moved closer, each step deliberate and predatory. But the change has begun. Can you not feel it? The hunger, the need to go deeper? Jakob's finger found his rifle's trigger, but his hand was shaking. Everything the creature said resonated with a horrible truth. He had been changing, had felt something awakening inside him with each visit to the caves. There is no stopping it, the creature continued. But there is choosing. Come with us. Learn to embrace what you will become, or fight it and become something worse. Outside, wind howled through the abandoned camp, but Jakob barely heard it. The choice before him was impossible. Accept this monstrous transformation or resist and become something even more terrible. The creature smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Decide quickly, little hunter. The others are coming. The cave entrance yawned before them like a wound in the mountainside, partially concealed behind a curtain of ice-crusted vines. Marcus felt his breath catch as he recognized the markings carved into the stone, the same symbols he'd seen on the metallic fragments from his traps, now weathered by centuries but unmistakably identical. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that seemed to moan through the opening. "The source." Marcus adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of the rifle across his shoulders. The weapon felt inadequate now, almost primitive against whatever lay within. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since they'd begun their ascent, and frost formed on their breath with each exhale. The interior stretched into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. Water dripped somewhere in the depths, each drop echoing like a countdown. Marcus took the lead, Sarah close behind, their beams cutting through air thick with moisture and something else, and metallic scent that reminded him of blood and electricity. 20 feet in, the natural cave walls gave way to something else entirely. The stone had been carved, shaped with tools that left surfaces smooth as glass. More symbols covered every inch, spiraling deeper into the mountain's heart. Sarah ran her fingers along the carvings, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. "These aren't random," she said. "It's a language, a warning system, warning about..." Before she could answer, a sound echoed from ahead, not quite mechanical, not quite organic. It reminded Marcus of his grandfather's old radio picking up signals from distant stations, except the static seemed to pulse with intention. They moved deeper, following a corridor that sloped steadily downward. The air grew warmer, which should have been comforting, but instead filled Marcus with dread. This deep underground warmth meant energy, and energy meant something was generating heat. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and Marcus's flashlight revealed something that made him stumble backward. The cavern walls curved upward into shadows, but the floor was covered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift when caught in peripheral vision. At the center sat a structure that defied easy description. Part machine, part architecture, constructed from the same dark material as the fragments in his traps. "My God," Sarah breathed. "It's a ship." Marcus saw it now, the curved hull, the smooth surfaces designed for movement through space or atmosphere, but it was damaged, split open like a cracked egg. Its contents spilled across the cavern floor. Pieces of the vessel lay scattered everywhere, some as large as boulders, others fragment-sized. His traps had been catching pieces of this wreckage for months, as weather and time slowly broke it apart. "How long has it been here?" he asked. Sarah approached the nearest section of hull, her scientific curiosity overriding caution. The integration with the cave structure suggests centuries, maybe longer. She paused, studying something. "But Marcus, look at this." He joined her at what might have been a control panel, though the organic curves and flowing surfaces looked nothing like human technology. Lights pulsed beneath the translucent surface, faint but definitely active. "It's still functional," she said. "Whatever this is, parts of it are still running." That's when they heard footsteps. Marcus spun around, rifle raised, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah grabbed his arm, pointing toward the far side of the chamber where their flashlight beams revealed another passage. "We're not alone," she whispered. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by that strange static-like sound they'd heard earlier. But now Marcus could hear patterns in it, rhythms that suggested communication. Something was trying to talk. A figure emerged from the shadows at the passage mouth, humanoid but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, movements too fluid, skin that seemed to absorb rather than reflect their flashlight beams. It wore clothing that might have been a uniform, though the material looked like living metal. When it spoke, the words came out in perfect English, though its mouth barely moved. "You should not be here," it said, voice carrying harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "This place is quarantined." Sarah stepped forward despite Marcus's restraining hand. "You're from the ship. A survivor." Survivor. The being seemed to consider the word. "Yes, though survival here has costs you cannot understand." It gestured toward the damaged vessel. "We fell from the void between stars. I have waited so long for rescue that I had forgotten it might come." "What happened to your ship?" Sarah asked. "Sabotage. My own people, attempting to prevent our arrival." The being's attention shifted to Marcus. "Your primitive traps have been collecting our technology, bringing it to the surface where it doesn't belong." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "The things I caught, they're pieces of your ship?" "Living metal, programmed to eventually reunite with the main vessel. You've been helping us rebuild." The being's head tilted in what might have been gratitude or threat, whether you intended to or not. In the pulsing light of the alien technology, Marcus realized they weren't discovering an ancient mystery. They were standing in the middle of something that was very much alive and getting stronger. The ancient symbols carved into the cavern walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as Kai pressed himself against the cold stone, listening to the creature's guttural communications echoing from deeper within the mountain. His grandfather's journal clutched in his trembling hands, he finally understood the horrifying truth behind generations of warnings about the high peaks. The Watchers weren't just legend, they were real, and they had been using his family's trap lines as an early warning system for decades. A low growl reverberated through the chamber, followed by what sounded like claws scraping against rock. Kai forced himself to remain perfectly still, knowing that even the slightest movement could give away his position. The beam of his flashlight had died 20 minutes ago, leaving him in absolute darkness save for the eerie phosphorescent glow emanating from the symbols themselves. According to his grandfather's journal, the markings told a story of an ancient pact, one that his ancestors had made with these creatures to keep them contained within the deepest reaches of the mountain. In exchange for regular offerings left in specific locations, the Watchers would remain hidden, feeding on the wildlife that wandered into the designated areas. The trap lines weren't just for hunting, they were a feeding system, carefully maintained to keep something far more dangerous satisfied and dormant. But someone had broken the pact. Kai thought about the empty traps he'd discovered over the past weeks, the strange tracks, the missing hikers. The offerings hadn't been made. The careful balance his family had maintained for over a century had been shattered, and now the Watchers were emerging, hungry and angry. A shadow moved across the phosphorescent wall, huge and impossibly elongated. Kai held his breath as something massive shuffled past his hiding spot, so close he could smell its rank, musky odor. Through the dim green glow, he caught a glimpse of matted fur, powerful shoulders, and eyes that reflected light like polished obsidian. The creature paused directly in front of his alcove. Kai's heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed deeper into the shadows, praying the narrow crevice would conceal him. The thing's breathing was deep and deliberate, each exhalation creating visible puffs in the frigid air. It was testing for scent, listening for the slightest sound that would betray an intruder's presence. Long seconds stretched into eternity before the creature finally moved on, its footsteps fading into the labyrinthine depths of the cave system. Kai waited until he could no longer hear any trace of movement before allowing himself to breathe normally again. He needed to get out of here, needed to warn someone about what was happening. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he realized how impossible that would be. Who would believe him? The authorities would think he'd suffered altitude sickness or hypothermia-induced hallucinations. By the time anyone took him seriously, more people would disappear. The journal's final entry, written in his grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting, provided the only solution. There was a way to renew the pact, to restore the balance that kept the Watchers contained. But it required a blood offering, not just animal blood, but human blood from someone of the bloodline. Kai's hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. His grandfather had known this day would come, had known that eventually someone would fail to maintain the ancient agreement. The old man had prepared for this possibility, leaving detailed instructions about the ritual that could reset everything. But the ceremony had to be performed at the heart of the Watchers' domain, in the deepest chamber where their queen resided. And according to the journal's cryptic warnings, she was far more intelligent and dangerous than her offspring. Another sound echoed through the cavern, different this time. It wasn't the guttural communication he'd heard before, but something that made his blood run cold, singing. A woman's voice, hauntingly beautiful, drifting through the stone passages like a siren's call. Kai recognized the melody. His grandmother used to hum it while working in her garden, claiming it was an old mountain song passed down through generations. Now he understood its true purpose. It wasn't just a song, it was a summoning call, and someone was using it to draw the creatures out. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident or a result of neglect. Someone was deliberately breaking the pact, intentionally releasing the Watchers from their ancient prison. But why? The singing grew louder, more insistent, and Kai could hear the creatures responding, their excited growls and movements creating a symphony of impending doom. He had to move now, had to reach the Queen's chamber before whoever was controlling this situation could complete whatever they had planned. Gripping the journal tightly, Kai emerged from his hiding place and began navigating the phosphorescent-lit passages, following the increasingly complex map his grandfather had drawn decades ago. Behind him, the mountain itself seemed to be awakening, and he could feel the weight of countless predatory eyes tracking his every step through the darkness. The abandoned ranger station materialized through the swirling snow like a ghost from another era. Jake pressed himself against the weathered log wall, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air. Through the cracked window, he could see the warm glow of a fire, casting dancing shadows across the interior walls. They were inside. He crept around the perimeter, noting the tactical positioning of his pursuers. These weren't random government agents. They moved with military precision, their equipment state-of-the-art. Whatever Marcus had stumbled upon in those caves, it was worth killing for. The radio crackled softly from his pack. Marcus's voice, barely a whisper. "Jake, you there?" Jake pressed the device close to his ear. "I'm here. Are you safe?" "For now. I'm in the old fire tower, about half a mile northeast of you." "Jake, I found something else in the cave. Documents. This whole mountain is sitting on top of something they call Project Whiteout. It's been going on for decades." Jake's blood ran cold. "What kind of project?" "Bioweapons research. The creatures we've been tracking, they're not aliens or mutants. They're test subjects that escaped from an underground facility. The government has been using our mountain as a testing ground, and when things went wrong, they just left." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The strange tracks, the aggressive behavior of local wildlife, the inexplicable changes he'd noticed in the forest over the years. His grandfather's warnings about certain areas of the mountain suddenly made terrible sense. A twig snapped behind him. Jake spun around to find Agent Collins emerging from the tree line, her weapon trained on his chest. Her face was a mask of professional determination, but he caught something else in her eyes. Regret, maybe even guilt. "Drop your rifle, Jake." Slowly, he complied, setting the weapon in the snow. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "About what they did to our mountain. About the testing." Collins's expression flickered. "Longer than I'd like to admit. The cleanup operation should have happened 20 years ago, but the funding got diverted. Too many other priorities, they said. And now? Now we have multiple breach incidents. The containment protocols failed completely 6 months ago. What your friend found in that cave, those specimens have been breeding, evolving. Jake felt sick. How many people know? More than you'd think. Your grandfather knew. He was part of the original research team before he had a change of heart. Collins's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He's the one who sabotaged the facility's containment systems. He wanted to expose the whole program. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His grandfather, the man who'd taught him to respect the mountain, to read its moods and navigate its dangers, had been involved in creating this nightmare. But he'd also tried to stop it. The traps, Jake breathed. He taught me to build them to catch these things, didn't he? He knew they were still out there. Collins nodded grimly. He spent the last 20 years of his life trying to protect people from what he'd helped create, and now that responsibility falls to you. A howl echoed across the mountainside. Not quite animal, not quite human. Collins's head snapped toward the sound, her professional composure cracking. They're active again. The cold weather makes them aggressive, drives them to hunt in packs. She looked back at Jake. There's something else you need to know. The facility isn't completely abandoned. There's still a skeleton crew down there, trying to develop a way to neutralize the specimens. But they're losing ground. Where? The entrance is hidden beneath the old mining operation on the north face. Your grandfather sealed most of the access points, but there's still one way in. Another howl, closer this time. Through the ranger station windows, Jake could see the other agents moving with sudden urgency. Collins made a decision that seemed to surprise even her. She stepped back and gestured toward Jake's rifle. Pick it up. What? You know this mountain better than any of us. You've been tracking these things your whole life without even realizing it. We need your help. Jake hesitated. And Marcus? Your friend stays alive, and so do you, if you help us end this. But Jake, once you know the full truth, there's no going back. You'll be part of this whether you want to be or not. The howls were multiplying now, creating a symphony of unnatural sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. Jake thought of his grandfather's journals, filled with cryptic warnings and carefully detailed trap designs. Everything had been preparation for this moment. He picked up his rifle and checked the chamber. What do you need me to do? Collins smiled for the first time since he'd met her. Help us go hunting. The ancient stone chamber trembled as Marcus pressed his palm against the crystalline surface of the containment wall. The moment his skin made contact, electricity shot through his nervous system, and suddenly he could hear them, thousands of voices screaming in harmonious agony from within the crystal prison. Don't! Elena's voice cut through the psychic maelstrom, but it was too late. The connection had been made. Marcus saw everything in a cascade of alien memories. The beings weren't invaders, they were refugees. Their world had died in stellar fire eons ago, and they had fled across the void in desperation, seeking only a place to survive. But their arrival had triggered an ancient defense system built by Earth's previous inhabitants, beings that had ascended beyond physical form long before humanity's ancestors crawled from primordial seas. The mountain itself was the weapon. The entire range was a massive containment grid, powered by geothermal energy and maintained by bloodlines like Elena's family, guardians who had forgotten their true purpose over millennia, reducing sacred duty to mere ritual. They're dying, Marcus gasped, his hands still fused to the crystal surface by forces he couldn't comprehend. They've been dying for thousands of years, and the mountain's been feeding on their life force. Elena moved toward him, her weathered face etched with confusion and growing horror. That's not what the old stories say. They're monsters, parasites. My grandmother told me. Your grandmother was wrong. Marcus felt the alien's desperation flooding through him. Or the stories got corrupted over time. Look for yourself. Through the crystal, shapes moved in the ethereal prison. Not the savage creatures Elena had described, but graceful beings of pure energy, their forms beautiful and terrible in their alien complexity. They pulsed with a light that grew dimmer with each passing moment, like stars slowly burning out. The ground shook again, more violently this time. Dust rained from the chamber ceiling as ancient supports strained against geological forces they were never meant to withstand. "The containment system is failing," Elena said, checking readings on instruments embedded in the stone walls. "Has been for decades. That's why more of them have been appearing in your traps. They're breaking free piece by piece." Marcus finally managed to pull his hand away from the crystal, staggering backward as the alien voices faded to a whisper in his mind. "What happens if the whole system collapses?" Elena's silence was answer enough. "There has to be another way," Marcus insisted. "These beings aren't evil. They're just trying to survive, like any refugee population. Maybe we can help them find somewhere else to go, somewhere they won't threaten Earth." "You think I haven't considered that?" Elena's composure cracked, revealing years of hidden doubt. "Do you think my family enjoyed being prison guards for millennia? But every time we've tried to modify the containment, to find alternatives, the mountain responds with earthquakes, avalanches, volcanic activity. It's like the defense system has a mind of its own." As if responding to her words, the chamber's crystalline walls began to pulse with ominous light. The aliens' forms pressed against their prison, and Marcus could feel their growing excitement. They sensed weakness, opportunity. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, gathering her equipment. "If this chamber breaches while we're inside—" The first crack appeared in the containment wall with a sound like breaking thunder. A tendril of pure energy escaped, coiling through the air like a living thing. Where it touched the stone floor, ancient rock simply ceased to exist. Marcus and Elena ran for the chamber entrance as more cracks spread across the crystal surface. Behind them, the alien prisoners pressed harder against their weakening bonds, their beautiful song becoming something urgent and wild. They reached the tunnel just as the chamber erupted in blinding light. The shockwave threw them against the rough stone walls, and Marcus felt his ribs crack from the impact. Elena cried out as her equipment bag scattered its contents across the tunnel floor. But they were alive. The mountain's defense system held, barely. The containment wall reformed itself, trapping the escaped energy and dragging it back into the collective prison. The alien's song faded to its previous mournful whisper. "How long?" Marcus asked, spitting blood from a bitten tongue. "How long before that containment fails completely?" Elena consulted one of her scattered instruments. Its screen cracked but still functional. Her face went pale in the device's glow. "Months, maybe weeks." She looked up at him with eyes that held the weight of impossible choices. "And when it happens, those beings will be free to inhabit any living creature they encounter, starting with every human settlement in a 1,000-mile radius." Marcus felt the mountain's ancient burden settling on his shoulders like a mantle of stone. Somewhere above them, his cabin waited in innocent isolation, but he knew he could never return to that simple life. The game had changed, and he was no longer just a player. He was becoming something else entirely. The real hunt was just beginning. The ancient chamber stretched before Marcus like a cathedral of nightmares, its walls pulsing with the same bioluminescent veins that had led him deeper into the mountain's heart. The air hung thick with an otherworldly hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones, and the smell, metallic and organic, like copper mixed with decay, made his stomach churn. His headlamp beam swept across the vast space, revealing structures that defied comprehension. Twisted spires of what looked like crystallized bone jutted from the floor, connected by web-like networks of the glowing filaments. At the chamber's center sat a massive construct, part machine and part living tissue, its surface rippling with mechanical precision. But it wasn't the alien architecture that made Marcus's blood freeze. It was the bodies. Dozens of human forms hung suspended in translucent pods along the chamber walls, their faces peaceful in artificial sleep. Marcus recognized some of them, hikers who had vanished over the years, locals who had simply disappeared into the wilderness. Sarah Henderson, who'd gone missing 3 summers ago. Old Pete Morrison, the trapper who'd walked into the woods one day and never returned. They were alive. Marcus could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests, the faint flutter of eyelids in dream states. Tubes snaked from the pods into the central construct, feeding it with something Marcus didn't want to contemplate. A sound echoed through the chamber, footsteps on stone. Marcus spun toward the entrance he'd descended through, but the approaching figure wasn't coming from that direction. Instead, it emerged from the shadows near the construct, moving with predatory grace. It wore the shape of his grandfather, but Marcus knew better now. The eyes held depths that human pupils couldn't contain, and when it smiled, the expression carried weight of centuries rather than the warm familiarity of family. "You've seen the heart of it now," the thing said, its voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's walls resonate. "Beautiful, isn't it? Your kind has such potential when properly guided." Marcus kept his rifle trained on the creature, though he suspected conventional weapons would prove useless here. "What are you?" "We are gardeners," it replied, gesturing toward the suspended humans. "Your species shows remarkable adaptability but lacks direction. We provide that direction. In return, you provide us with the energy needed to flourish in this reality." The mechanical portions of the central construct shifted, revealing glimpses of organic components pulsing beneath metallic surfaces. Marcus realized with horror that the machine was built from harvested biological material, human and otherwise, fused with technology beyond terrestrial origin. "The mountain folk knew," Marcus said, pieces of the puzzle clicking together. "The old stories, the warnings about the deep places. They were trying to protect us. The indigenous inhabitants proved resistant to our methods," the creature acknowledged. "They developed crude but effective countermeasures. Those symbols you discovered, the materials in your ancestors' traps, they understood enough to contain us for generations." Marcus thought of the carved warnings, the specific combinations of metals and stones his family had used, without truly understanding their significance. But something changed. "You're stronger now." The creature's false smile widened. "Your modern world provides so many opportunities: satellite communications, global positioning systems, quantum entanglement experiments. Your technology creates resonances we can exploit. Each advancement tears another small hole in the barriers that once contained us." A new sound filled the chamber, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The pods along the walls pulsed brighter, and the humans within began to stir more restlessly. "The convergence accelerates," the creature said, genuine excitement coloring its stolen voice. "Soon, we will have accumulated enough bioelectric potential to fully manifest. Your reality will become ours, shaped according to our needs rather than the chaotic whims of evolution." Marcus backed toward the chamber's edge, mind racing through options. The rifle was useless, but he still carried some of the materials from his grandfather's trap, the specific metals and carved stones that had somehow held these things at bay for decades. "You won't leave this place," the creature said, reading his intentions. "You've seen too much, learned too much, but we can offer you something better than death." It gestured toward an empty pod that hadn't been there moments before, its surface already beginning to emit the familiar organic glow. "Join them willingly and retain some measure of your consciousness. Continue to resist, and we will simply take what we need while you watch, helpless and aware." The thrumming grew louder, and Marcus realized it was coming from above, from the surface. The creature's influence was spreading, reaching beyond the mountain's depths toward the outside world. He thought of Elena, probably still searching for him in the wilderness above, of the town beyond the forest, full of people who had no idea what was stirring beneath their feet, of all the other mountains, other deep places, where similar guardians might be awakening after long slumber. Marcus pulled the carved stone from his pocket, feeling its weight. One last gamble, one final chance to stop this before it spread beyond containment. The creature's expression shifted as it recognized what he held. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the last of the military vehicles disappear down the mountain road. The silence that followed felt different somehow, cleaner, like the air after a thunderstorm. He flexed his bandaged shoulder, wincing slightly at the reminder of how close he'd come to joining his grandfather in whatever realm awaited beyond these peaks. Dr. Sarah Chen had stayed behind to oversee the final containment protocols, her hazmat team methodically sealing the cave entrance with a specialized polymer that would harden into something resembling natural rock. She approached him now, pulling off her protective hood and shaking out her dark hair. "The readings are stable," she said, consulting a handheld device. "Whatever energy source was powering those things, it's completely dormant now." Ethan nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the cave mouth. "My grandfather always said the mountain keeps its secrets for a reason. Maybe some doors are meant to stay closed. The government will classify this site," Sarah continued. "Officially, there was a minor avalanche that required geological assessment. The area will be marked as unstable and off-limits to hikers. And unofficially?" She was quiet for a moment, studying the readings on her device. "Unofficially, we'll monitor it. Indefinitely, there are too many unanswered questions about what we found down there, the technology, the preservation methods, the connection to your family's history. But that's not your burden anymore." Ethan turned to face her fully. "What about the other sites, the ones your satellite scans detected?" "One step at a time," Sarah replied. "What happened here proves that some discoveries need careful handling. We won't make the same mistakes Dr. Morrison's team made 20 years ago." The mention of Morrison sent a chill through Ethan that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The truth about the previous expedition, about the cover-up and the lives lost, would remain buried in classified files, but at least now he understood why his grandfather had chosen isolation, why the old man had spent decades standing guard over something he couldn't fully explain. Sarah packed away her equipment and shouldered her gear bag. "The offer still stands, you know. The research division could use someone with your skills and knowledge of this terrain." "I appreciate it," Ethan said, and he meant it. "But I belong here." She smiled, the expression transforming her serious features. "I thought you might say that. If you change your mind or if anything unusual happens, anything at all, you have my direct line." They shook hands, and Ethan watched her trek down the mountain path until she vanished among the trees. Then he was truly alone for the first time in days, surrounded by the vast silence of his domain. He made his way back to the cabin, noting automatically which of his trap lines would need to be reset, which sections of the perimeter required fresh sign cutting. The familiar routines felt grounding after everything that had happened, anchoring him to the life he'd built in this wilderness sanctuary. Inside the cabin, he found his grandfather's journal lying open on the kitchen table where he'd left it. The old man's careful handwriting filled the pages with observations about the mountain's moods, the migration patterns of elk and deer, the subtle signs that preceded avalanches and storms. But scattered throughout were other entries, references to the watchers and the old responsibilities that finally made sense. Ethan turned to a fresh page and began writing his own entry, documenting the events of the past few days in the same measured prose his grandfather had used. Future generations would need to know, even if the official records remained sealed. The truth had a way of surfacing when it mattered most. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, he ventured back outside to check his remaining traps. Most were empty, but the snare near the creek had caught a fat rabbit, a normal, ordinary rabbit with no glowing eyes or unnatural stillness. He reset the trap with practiced efficiency and headed home with dinner secured. That evening, as he prepared the rabbit over the wood stove, Ethan found himself listening to the mountain's voice with new understanding. The wind through the peaks, the settling of snow-laden branches, the distant call of a hunting owl, all of it spoke to him of continuity, of an ancient rhythm that would outlast governments and classifications and scientific expeditions. His grandfather had chosen this life not out of fear, but out of love, love for these wild places and the responsibility that came with protecting them. Now that guardianship had passed to Ethan, along with the knowledge to exercise it wisely. He ate his simple meal by lamplight, planning tomorrow's patrol route and thinking about the spring thaw still months away. When it came, he would repair the winter's damage to his traps and shelters, reset his boundaries, and continue the patient work of watching over his mountain home. Some secrets were worth keeping, some vigils were worth maintaining, and some responsibilities were inherited in the blood.